Thank you so much, sir, for sorting this out. And so I'm Dr. Shayanti Talwar, and I'm very happy to be a part of this 5-day FDP. And I'm thrilled to see participants who are so enthusiastic despite the deluge of webinars. And I'm very happy that you have turned up in such great numbers. And I hope that today's session turns out to be a constructive one and a useful one for all of you. And I'm looking at engaging with you for the next 1.5 to 2 hours. And it's going to be a two-way process. And I'm really hoping that I also get to learn a lot from your inputs and observations. So the title of my talk is Ecofeminist Underpinnings from Myth to Contemporary Times. Right, and I will start. So, sir, can I request you to just put up my slide, the first slide, so that I can start with my presentation?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, and I will request all the participants to kindly mute themselves. Faces are fine. I'd like to have your videos on if you don't mind, because that will at least, make me feel motivated that I can see people watching the presentation, and uh, it'll give me a feeling that we are in this together. Right. So is my first slide visible?
Yes, ma'am, it is
You can
visible.
just say, okay, great. All right. Thank you so much for the chat response also. So, like I said, my topic is eco-feminist underpinnings. I understand that you have been familiarized with a lot of the background and the theories and the concerns of eco-criticism and green literature. So, I'm going to look at ecofeminism today. And I'm going to be looking at ecofeminist concerns through centuries and more exclusively in myths, uh, just kind of an overview in myths, and then most of it in contemporary times. Next slide, please, sir. Can we have the next slide, please? No, the slide before that. Okay, so this is going to be the overview of my talk. So I'm going to be dealing with, first of all, what is ecofeminism? So I'm going to be taking you through ecofeminism. Then we are going to be looking at myth, and followed by the ecofeminist framework. And I'm going to be juxtaposing it with the Western hegemonical discursive framework. And then the ecofeminist critique of science, the whole of Western intellectual tradition, imperialism, the neoliberal project, and the modernization project. Then we're going to be looking at ecofeminism and its intersections with culture. Well, my presentation has disappeared. So can I have it back, please? uh, Ma'am, can we have, okay, thank you so much, ma'am. Yeah, so then we're going to be looking at ecofeminism and the intersections with culture and animal rights. Then ecofeminism as activism. Well, mostly as academicians, we understand ecofeminism as probably an area of literary criticism, but it's also a lot of activism. Right, so we're going to be looking at the activists who are actually working on the ground, and also some landmark ecofeminist movements which gained global recognition and which fueled a lot of other movements around the globe. And then finally, yes, because I'm just presuming that we are all teachers of literature over here. So we are going to be looking at ecofeminism as a critical tool for theorists. And I would like to attempt an ecofeminist reading of a very well-known novel, which is often prescribed at the undergraduate level for students of English literature. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's William Golding's The Lord of the Flies, and it got him the Nobel Prize. So we're going to be looking at an eco-feminist analysis of the text. So this is the plan of my talk, and I hope I am able to accomplish it with your help. So let's move on to the next slide and start with what is ecofeminism. So, ecofeminism primarily is an approach, it's a connection between the exploitation and degradation of the natural world on the one hand and the subordination and oppression of women. So, both the natural world and women are treated as spaces, and they're treated as passive entities that can be territorialized, exploited, used, and invaded. Ecofeminism as a movement, as an awakening, it started somewhere in the mid 1970s, right? And it went alongside with, if you remember, the second wave of feminism. Those of you who are into gender studies and feminist theories or feminist history, you would remember that this was also the time of radical feminism. So ecofeminism came about around that time in the 1970s, alongside the second wave of feminism and the green movement. So you also had a lot of environmental movements around that time. So ecofeminism, because it brought these two movements together, right? Uh, there's a lot of, uh, just give me one sec. Yeah. So ecofeminism brought together feminism and environmental concerns, and it emerged somewhere around the 1970s. Now, as a theory, ecofeminism has its roots in the labor movement, in women's healthcare, the peace movements, the anti-nuclear movement, the environmental movement, and the animals' rights movement. So it kind of incorporates the concerns of all these movements, right? And all of these movements, if you note, you will realize that all of these movements protest some or the other kind of inequality or oppression, or the presence of some kind of violence or some violent means adopted by the state. That is, the people in power or institutions that are in power or state authorities and other hegemonic institutions. Now, what is the basic premise of ecofeminism? So, I'm going to be quoting Greta Gard, who is a very noted ecofeminist over here, and she says, and I quote, the ideology which authorizes oppressions such as those based on race, class, gender, sexuality, physical abilities, and species is the same ideology which sanctions the oppression of nature. Right? So, if you reflect on this quote, you will realize that this quote draws a parallel, or rather, it establishes a connection between all forms of systemic and institutionalized oppression, which makes society highly inequitable. It privileges some and deprivileges others. Now, for this to happen beyond doubt, for this kind of a discourse to even be created and circulated and ratified, for nature to be oppressed and used, or as women or weaker sections to be oppressed and used, it requires some kind of a divine sanction, right? Some institutional ratification. And that is where myths come in. So, can we have the next slide, please? So we're going to be looking at Indian myths first. And of course, there are many myths, but I've just taken two from Indian mythology and two, three instances from Greek mythology because we are hard pressed for time. So here, the first myth I'm going to be sharing with you is that of Prithu and Prithvi. Maybe you're familiar with it. So basically, myths, if you realize what is the relevance of myths or what is the function of myths, myths have always equated women with nature. In Indian mythology, especially, the feminine principle is a combination, as you know, of Shakti and Prakriti, which stand for power and nature, respectively. But the possibility of both nature and woman being unduly exploited by men of power can be traced very clearly in Indian mythology. So you can say that Indian mythology had ecofeminist concerns, or at least there was an ecofeminist depiction in Indian mythology. So to first. The first instance is that of Prithu and Prithvi. So, in the myth of Prithu, Prithu is supposed to be a part incarnation of Vishnu, and in the myth of Prithu, Prithvi, who is Lakshmi, is actually Prithu's daughter. That is Vishnu's daughter. Normally, we understand Lakshmi to be the partner of Vishnu, but in this particular myth, she is his daughter. Now, Prithu, and I'm sure people down south will be more aware of this mythology because it occurs mostly in South Indian classical texts. So, Prithu is the son of the evil king Veena, whose reign spells anarchy as he fails to observe the Vedic rituals, and curse befalls the land. Now, Veena is killed by the sages who then churn his corpse. It's quite violent. The imagery is quite violent. So, they churn his corpse, out of which emerges a dark dwarf who is the concentration of all that is negative, right? Or the shadow self. We've studied in psychology and psychoanalysis, so it's the shadow self of Veena. Out of the remaining remains, the residual remains, which are now pure, rises Prithu, who is also regarded as a part incarnation of Vishnu, as he is born of a man's body without a woman. So he's also a Yonija. A Yonija means without one who does not come out of a yoni or a woman's reproductive organ, right? So Prithu's birth, and now why is Prithu born? It is basically to primarily negotiate with Bhudevi or the earth, a form of Lakshmi who has taken the form of a cow and run away to escape the atrocities of the evil king. So you can see in the picture over here that Prithu is chasing the cow. We don't know whether it's Prithu who is chasing or Veena who has exploited the cow, but the earth has taken the form of a cow and she's run away. And Prithu has come, has incarnated to negotiate with the earth. So yes, so this is Prithu's, because Prithu chases the earth, but she refuses to return, saying she cannot bear to be exploited any further. Now, Prithu convinces her to come back with him, promising her that she will not be exploited and be milked. Milked is the word that is used. She'll be milked on his watch. Prithu then milks the earth by summoning Manu in the form of a calf, for the earth to be replenished with vegetation and natural resources once again. Thus guarded and assured of her safety by Prithu, the earth comes upon being regarded as Prithvi, the daughter of Prithu, who Prithu is looking out for. So in her identification as the earth goddess and the metaphor of the cow to symbolize her, nature, if you realize, is feminized, right? Now, let's go to the other myth, which is where Lakshmi, now Lakshmi had multiple fathers actually. One of her fathers is also Varun, because she emerges from the sea during the Samudra Manthan. But here we are not talking about that father. We are talking about another father of Lakshmi, who is Puloman. Now, who is Puloman? Puloman. So, Puloman is actually the god of the underworld. So, Lakshmi is also believed to be the daughter of the Asura Puloman. On a symbolic level, this would refer to, now, if Puloman is the god of the underworld, or the netherworld rather, this would refer to the mineral reserves, the fossil fuels, and the precious stones which are found under the earth, all amounting for immense wealth, right? Now, as the daughter of Puloman, Lakshmi is called Pulami, the princess of the netherworld and the source of all wealth and buried treasures. Puloman is attacked and killed by Indra, and Pulami taken as his wife. So Indra attacks, he kills Puloman, and he abducts Pulami, and he takes her as his wife, after which Pulami starts being addressed as Sachi, that is the wife of Sachin. Sachin is another name for Indra, or she's also called Indrani, that is another epithet for the wife of Indra. Right? Now, symbolically seen, this myth possibly alludes to the violation of the earth by the Devas, who could be the light-skinned migrants, right? And their pursuit of extracting natural resources from the earth, especially metals and minerals, right? So this could be read at a symbolic level also, from the point of view of cultural anthropology. And devas may not be devas, but they could be invaders or migrants who are of a lighter skin, and this myth could have an encoded message of how these migrants actually extracted the wealth of the earth, which is conveyed through the myth of Indra attacking Pulaman and forcefully taking his daughter Pulami as his wife. So again, over here, if you see nature, earth, woman, all of it are, there's a connection drawn between all three entities, and nature is feminized. Can we have the next slide, please? Now, moving on to Greek mythology. Now, in Greek mythology, the primordial Greek goddess Gaia, who is also the Earth Mother, is supposed to have borne the mountains, the sea, all of the gods, with again the cow as her symbol, standing for nourishment. So, one thing in common between Greek and Indian mythology is the symbol of the cow as the Earth Mother. Gaia is also the grandmother of Zeus. Now, Zeus, you know, is the equivalent of Indra. So, she is the grandmother of the king of gods, Zeus, since she is the mother of Zeus's mother, Rhea. So, you have the earth goddess, the personification of the earth goddess in the form of a woman who is Gaia. Then, moving on to the earth mother, who is Demeter. Now, Demeter, in fact, the ancient word meter is mother. So mother's ancient equivalent would be meter. And this word is actually embedded in the name of this goddess, Demeter. So in Greek mythology, the wealth on the surface of the earth, we saw in Indian mythology also that there's something on the surface of the earth where, when we saw the mythology of Prithu and Prithvi. And then there's something under the earth, inside the earth, which we saw in the mythology of Pulaman and Pulami. So similarly, in Greek mythology, the wealth on the surface of the earth and the wealth which is under the earth are depicted by two different goddesses. One is Demeter and the other is her daughter Persephone. So if you see to your right, to the right of the slide, you have the scene where Demeter is actually reaching out to Persephone, who is being abducted by Hades, who is the god of the underworld. So I'll just take you through the myth. So here, the name of Demeter and Persephone in context of the earth is always taken together. Persephone is abducted by Hades, the god of the underworld. And Demeter is so infuriated that she will not let anything grow on the earth till her daughter returns. Zeus, under a lot of pressure, pleads with Hades to release Persephone. But just as she's about to leave Hades, what Hades does is he gives her a pomegranate seed to eat, thus making sure that she will be under an obligation to keep returning to the netherworld and she will not be able to stay with her mother permanently. Thus, Persephone is forced to spend 1/3 of the year with Hades underground. The act of Persephone's eating the pomegranate seed is symbolic of a compromise that changes the world forever. Whereas she might have expected an immortal existence with her mother on Mount Olympus, Persephone becomes the central figure in a new cycle of life and death. She is both queen of the underworld as wife of Hades and associated with the new life that rises with the spring. So this is the symbology in Greek mythology. So can we have the next slide, please? So now let us reflect on what these myths do. All of these myths do one thing. They feminize nature and they naturalize women. They establish the connection between women and nature in quite an irreversible and definitive way. Women are attributed qualities of nature and nature is attributed qualities of women. Both have creative and reproductive potential and both experience cycles. So that is the commonality. Now, the problem is not the connection. The problem is the reductionist attitude which treats them only as such. The problem started right at the time when groups of people started settling down and nomadic communities became pastoral communities. So, from hunting gathering communities, people started settling down, they started practicing agriculture, and slowly they turned into pastoral communities. Now, what happened once that transformation took place? Once the control over the fertility of the earth was established, it led to a territorialization of land. Land was plotted. There was the issue of ownership. There was a demarcation of property, and ownership of that land was established. Right? Now, this similar logic was applied to control the fertility of the woman, territorializing and owning her body and claiming her as property. Laws of inheritance thus started being applied to both land and woman. Like land belonged to someone and the crop it yielded belonged to that owner, the woman's body belonged to a man and the crop she yielded belonged to the man, to her owner, the husband who eventually became the father. And that is how you had the patriarchal system coming up, and the father's line, which became more important than the mother's line, right? So women, like nature, started being commodified. Now, it didn't stop here. Further, what happened was they started being commodified and reduced to their procreative capacities, their reproductive ability. So that is the reductionist attitude, which is problematic, which we need to problematize. They were regarded as passive, just as bearers, as vessels to receive the man's seed and then bring forth children. So ecofeminism's stand is against this oppression. It attempts to liberate both women and nature from this kind of a dichotomous discourse and framework where the woman, nature, earth, these are otherized, right? And they are lesser than man, right? Can we have the next slide, please? So, no, I think there's a slide before. Oh, yes. Okay. So this is the eco-feminist framework of critique. Now, what happens is if you look over here, you will find a clear dichotomy between the oppressor and the oppressed. Now, the oppressor, the way ecofeminism looks at the oppressor is generally, because oppression goes with the modernization project, it goes with industrialization, it goes with urbanization, it goes with the whole development project, which serves the interests of a very few elitist a section of the population, and it puts the major chunks of the population, a major part of society, at a disadvantage. So the oppressor is usually upper or middle class. The oppressor is human. He comes from an industrially developed, technologically advanced setting, and the oppressor is male, right? And against this, if you juxtapose, the oppressed would be people from the poor or working class, non-humans or animals, right? The oppressed would be non-humans or animals, or it could be women. And if the oppressor is industrially developed, the oppressed would be undeveloped. They would be unadvanced. And the oppressed is mostly nature and female, as we have seen through myths. Right? Can we have the next slide, please? Now, if you look at this dichotomy, this is the dichotomy which depicts the Western hegemonic discourse. Now, this is the post-Enlightenment Western tradition. So, ecofeminism posits that the oppression of nature and woman is based on a sense of a self that is separate and superior from the rest of creation. So it is culture versus nature, where nature is inferior, culture is superior. Reason is superior, again, nature or feelings, emotions, these are inferior. So now, when this is the belief, the result will be that this self will work in its own interest and resort to accumulating, amassing, assimilating resources and wealth and power at the expense of others, and will also take recourse to violent means. In fact, there is no way to avoid violence and exploitation because this self is fostered and prompted by greed and not need, right? So you have over here this dichotomy, and what this dichotomy does is it not only privileges people who are on the left hand side, people who are rational human beings. It attributes these qualities to men, to white men, uh, uh, and the white world, which is civilized, and it juxtaposes this white world, and it um, sets off the third world, or say the tribal world, uh, the world of the developing countries at a disadvantage, right? So this is the dichotomy between the self and the other. Can we have the next slide, please? Right. Now, we saw the critique of the ecofeminist critique of the framework. So, what is the ecofeminist framework? So, ecofeminism says that this separate self, which the Western hegemonic discourse propagates or promotes, it is very different from the interconnected self, which operates on an ethics of sharing, conservation, sustenance, and caring so that everyone has what they need. So that's the ecofeminist framework. It believes in a fundamental interconnectedness of all life. Okay? And this is a responsible consciousness, not a self serving or a self fulfilling one. Ecofeminism, the ecofeminist theory proposes that it does not work on the self other premise, but the self in each and all premise. So there's a self, there's the same self in everything, right? So ecofeminism and and the other part of the framework is that ecofeminism brings together academics and activism. It believes that for change to happen, theorists must share with activists. Also, ecofeminism believes in pluralism, diversity of voices, and also not only women's cause. It's not only about women, it's also about the cause of trees, plants, the soil, the animal world, the mineral reserves, the environment, even the poor, the tribals, everything, right? Uh, and the four aspects of ecofeminism are theory, politics, spirituality, and community. So, theory and politics was what I referred to earlier, right? That activism and academic concern, they go hand in hand. Spirituality refers to the sense of the interconnected self, and community is also of course the eco-feminist concern of sharing and a kind of a communal existence. Communal, not in the sense in which Indians understand, like not communal riots, but communal as in being part of a commune, right? Communal harmony. Right. Can we have the next slide, please? Now we'll be looking at why ecofeminism is so critical of it's so caustic towards the Western intellectual tradition. So, present day, even if you look at present day scientific and rational thinking, it is largely informed by the West. The Western intellectual tradition has always devalued any quality or aspect associated with women, like feelings, emotions, as opposed to logic and reason. Remember the earlier slide which we saw, which showed the fracture, so logic was on one side and feeling was on the other. In fact, the makes soldiers internalize this ideology early on that the nation's posturing has to show strength and masculine pride. It thrives on a culture of machismo. And the second influence on this is the influence of Semitic myths. The Semitic myths, in fact, reduced women. Like in Greek mythology and Indian mythology, you at least have the woman being reduced to nature or being relegated to the realm of nature. But in Semitic myths, if you see, there is no female goddess at all. They completely erased the divine feminine or the great goddess. So they they don't even say that nature, they don't equate woman with nature, or they don't personify nature as a woman. In the Semitic myths, she was directly reduced to an elemental quality, that is water, something that lacks form, shape, voice, and predictability, something that is just pure force and pure chaos. This relegation of woman to the natural world merely as a birthing instrument led to associating her with animals and nature. And post Enlightenment, with the development of scientific and rational thought and a renewed surge with the Industrial Revolution, certain qualities were assigned value and certain others devalued. So there were only two major concerns: modern scientific knowledge and economic development. And this came to be a Western patriarchal project, both historically and ideologically. Can we have the next slide, please? Now, ecofeminism's critique of science. Why is ecofeminism against indiscriminate scientific advancement? So it is no secret that indiscriminate industrialization and technological advancement have come at the expense of colossal environmental damage and degeneration. We are all witness to it, right? Increased scientific progress has also distanced and displaced man from his natural environment. Ecofeminism believes that the first and the most direct victims of modernization and development are nature and women. Industry effluents, toxic gases, deforestation, damming, mining, building of roads and infrastructure in ecologically sensitive areas have a straight impact on the ecosystem. Toxic pesticides, and similarly, so this is its ill effects on nature, and similarly you have toxic pesticides, chemical wastes, acid rain, radiation, and other pollutants take their first toll on women, women's reproductive system, and children. Also, scientific and medical breakthroughs are achieved by first testing them on third world women and animals. We are going to have a detailed look at that later on. So this is ecofeminism's critique of modern science. Can we have the next slide, please? Please. Now, ecofeminism and how it intersects with colonization and the market economy. Now, ecofeminism critiques the colonizing project of the Western world and believes that this is an ongoing project. Earlier, the colonizers, we all know, we have studied in our history textbooks in school, that the colonizers used the colonies, the colonized countries as a source of raw materials and a market for their finished goods. Now they carry on with their development agenda, focusing on their economy, their people, but at the expense of the third world countries. The policies of the first world nations reek of classism and racism. In today's free market economy, the heaviest toll the development of the first world patriarchal initiative takes is on the third world woman. Now, how is this? You might be wondering, why only the third world woman? Women, through farming, practice and preserve biodiversity. Corporatized farming or exclusive farming of one crop, which is also called monoculture, with a profit-making objective, finishes off biodiversity and also decreases indigenous varieties of grains, vegetables, and pulses. Sometimes even diverting a river can mean that instead of 2 and 2, that is 4 kilometers, the woman who fetches water will have to walk 5 and 5, 10 kilometers. It's as basic as that. And we don't realize it because for us, we turn on the tap and we have water. But that's just, just a very small percentage of the population. It's mostly women who fetch firewood, who source food in the forest, and who fetch water, right? Works of, in fact, you will find this explicitly described in the works of Vandana Shiva, in the political essays of Arundhati Roy, which give an account of how lives in tribal and rural areas are adversely affected because of modernizing and development initiatives. Damming has destroyed complete ecosystems, killed numerous species of fish and that bred in the river, natural vegetation that the river supported, crops that were grown on the rich alluvial deposits and the silt of the river, and entire communities that supported themselves and that sustained half the year through farming on the riverbank, and the rest of the other half of the year through fishing. These displaced communities, whose plight never makes it to the front page of any newspaper or to any news channel on national television, are displaced overnight. Their homes flooded, and they have to either forcibly migrate to the cities or become squatters on their own land. The slums and the homeless people that we keep seeing in our cities, who seem to mysteriously increase, and who we think are a nuisance, are often these people who have been forced to leave their dwelling place because there is no longer a dwelling place. So that's the new market economy project, right? And this population is bearing the toll of it simply because it's an expendable section of the population. They're just expendable and dispensable. Can we have the next slide, please? So we're going to be looking at some eco-feminist movements on the ground. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the Chipko movement. And in fact, the Chipko movement became such a global rage that it fueled many similar movements across the globe. So this Chipko movement began in the 1970s in Uttarakhand, and it became a rallying force, prompting many environmental movements across the world, like I said. It revived the power of non-violent struggle. It was an organized effort to slow down the indiscriminate deforestation in the name of economic progress. Though the movement has both men and women, women were at the fore because they were the worst hit by the felling of the thousands of trees that threatened to not only destabilize the entire ecology, but also deprive them of their sustenance as they stood to lose firewood, fodder, drinking water, and the topsoil held by trees required to grow crops. The movement is called Chipko. I'm sure you know, to indicate, and you can see in the photograph what these women are doing. They are hugging the trees, and these women kept hugging the trees and they stood their ground even when they were threatened by private contractors and state authorities, refusing to retreat and give away the trees to commercial lumberjacks. And it is said to have spread this movement, and the news of this movement spread from village to village like forest fire. In fact, imagine it just spread through poetry and songs, because back then they did not have Facebook and they did not have WhatsApp, right? And everywhere the lumberjacks went, they met with the same opposition. The movement achieved a victory when the government issued a ban on felling of trees in the Himalayan regions for 15 years in 1980 by the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, until the green cover was fully restored. So the government had to bring about a change in its policy. One of the prominent Chipko leaders, he's a Gandhian, Sundarlal Bahuguna, took a 5,000-kilometer trans-Himalaya foot march in 1981 to 83, spreading the Chipko message to a far greater area. Now, and then after that, gradually women set up cooperatives to guard local forests and also organized fodder production at rates conducive to local environment. So now you see how ecofeminism is a lot of activism also. It's not just theory which circulates only in ivory towers of the academia, and there are a few conferences and then it's forgotten. It's actually ecofeminism on the ground. And interestingly, we have heard of the Chipko movement, but this was not the first of its kind movement in India. The Chipko movement, in fact, took its inspiration from a similar incident which had occurred in the village of Khejarli in Rajasthan in 1730. Soldiers of the then Maharaja of Jodhpur, Abhay Singh, were sent to this village to cut khejri trees required to build a new palace for the king. The soldiers met with severe resistance from women of the Bishnoi sect or Samaj who followed a religion that was based on ecological preservation. So these women belonged to the Bishnoi sect. And these women were led by a woman called Amrita Devi, who refused to retreat and stood hugging the trees. The soldiers threatened to kill them, but this did not deter the women. Now, as a result of that, what happened, and it's unbelievable, the soldiers actually started killing the women. And around 363 women were slain before news reached the Maharaja about the violence and the massacre that was taking place, and he issued instructions to his soldiers to retreat. So the palace was eventually not built with the wood of the khejri trees, but in the process, 363 women sacrificed their lives to save the environment. So that's ecofeminism 300 years ago, right? Yeah, so can we have the next slide, please? Right. Ecofeminism and its intersections between with culture. So though ecofeminism's primary concern is nature, it also traces the systematic destruction of ways of life by imperial, colonial, earlier, and now corporate forces. The project of modernization aims, now what does the project of modernization want to do? It aims at a homogeneous, unified society. The brutal, violent history of colonization, of course, stands testimony to this. The white man ravaged the world and nature, destroying indigenous communities, their culture, their religion, and their way of life. In the process, the interconnectedness between these communities and nature, like those of the native Indians, the Africans, and the like, which was the cornerstone of these cultures, was lost. And lost were the ways of communion with the natural, like lost were the ways of communion with the natural world, the ways of conserving and yet remaining a part of the natural world. Now, what colonizers did till the early 20th century went on even after the colonies became maybe politically free, right? And how is that? Now it is corporates and governments that come to power with the help of corporate funding that are doing the job of systematically erasing indigenous communities and their ways of being, which are more sustainable, more environment friendly, more in harmony with nature, and that do not otherize nature, that treat nature as a living entity. And what happens to the women in these communities, which are in this state of a culture shock, because these communities, which have been very insulated and cocooned in nature, suddenly they are being exposed to this whole modernizing project. So what's the plight of the women of these communities? The women are again the worst hit. They are losing their old ways of being, community living, and shared sisterhood. Also, with neoliberal patriarchy seeping in, with its profit-making and commodifying obsession, women are being increasingly commodified. These communities, which were relatively more egalitarian, now we all know the hill communities, for example, certain tribal communities, they are a lot more egalitarian than mainstream communities. These communities are now undergoing ideological mainstreaming and social marginalization at the same time. So they are being indoctrinated with mainstream ideology, and at the same time, they are being marginalized economically, socially, and culturally. Now, an interesting writer, if you want to trace what is happening, is Mahashweta Devi, whose works bring out very poignantly the predicament of women in changing tribal societies as the boundaries between modern communities and indigenous ones keep blurring. So the boundaries are blurring and the women are taking the fall. And the atrocities at the hands of the state, the landowners, and the media that these women are subjected to. Now, there's another very noted journalist. I'm sure you must have heard of him. He has authored a very famous book, Everyone Loves a Good Drought, and that's P. Sainath. Now, P. Sainath gives us the horrid condition of tribals in the mining localities of Odisha and Jharkhand. With their natural self-sustaining existence gone, with the advent of the mining companies, these tribals have been displaced. Now, I was listening to one of P. Sainath's lectures, and in fact, you can go and look up the material on his website. You know, he is the one who has started PARI, PARI. It's an acronym. So, PARI Foundation, and you have all these accounts on his website. So, he was talking about this, these tribals who are so poor. Basically, they have been displaced from their own land by these mining companies, uh, which are mostly foreign owned, or sometimes they are owned by very renowned Indian corporates. And they, how they try to survive, they try to steal some of the excess coal that lies as waste, and they are jailed for it. Now, the women then, now what happens to the woman in this case? Now, the woman was already facing enough hardships of fetching firewood, water, food, has to now run from pillar to post, either to get her husband out of jail, right? Which takes her to the law enforcement authorities. And we all know how that fares. Or she's forced to fend for the family either by working at half the wages for more time with the local landowner, or at the colliery, or as a worker in the mines. So she's normally paid much less than what her husband gets paid. This makes her vulnerable. And besides, because she's a woman and a sexualized being, it makes her vulnerable to her employer and the state, as both are hand in glove with each other. I can sense some disturbance. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, it is audible.
Okay, I just sense some disturbance. I don't know. Okay, so I'll continue. Right. So, like I said, in his book, Everybody Loves a Good Drought, and you must read the book. It's a fabulous read. He tells us exactly, he, as in P. Sainath, tells us exactly how a small section of the privileged and the elitist population continues to reap and enjoy the benefits of development, while the vast majorities of rural and tribal India wallow in abject poverty. In that sense, you will realize that eco-feminist politics is very closely intertwined with third world economy, third world politics, and third world social inequities. Right? Can we have the next slide, please? Right. Now, let's look at ecofeminism and its concerns with animals. Now, I'm going to, you have a quote by Laurie Gruen, and she says, animals as sluggish meat-making machines and reluctant laborers, and women as breeders of children. So ecofeminism looks at the categories of woman and animal as receiving the same treatment and position of the other in patriarchy. So the animal is also the other, that is the non-human, and the woman is also the other because she is non-man. Scholars of, in fact, and why is this? Because both are passive, they need to be dominated and used. In fact, scholars of linguistic feminism also happen to have done considerable work in this area, and they have shown how animal and feminine metaphors are used quite interchangeably. A woman, when sexualized, is often seen as something to be consumed, like food, like the meat of a dead animal. A woman, like an animal, is identified as her body parts, which are consumed and relished. Both need to serve or be served up. Of course, this is a linguistically constructed connection, though the politics is to make it look natural. In fact, if you want to get a very nice feel of it in fiction, I will suggest you read this book by Margaret Atwood. It's one of her, I think it's her very first novel, the noted Canadian novelist. It's called The Edible Woman, where uh, feminine imagery is constantly juxtaposed with food imagery. And the woman develops a nausea for food because she begins to have this mounting feeling that she's being treated as a consumable. So it's beautifully brought out in this work of fiction. Now, this equating woman and animal, this discourse also has its roots in 20th century Western anthropology, which valorized man the hunter, who was superior to animals primarily because of his ability to hunt and destroy. Woman as non-hunter was naturally then relegated to the sphere of the weak and inferior. With agriculture comes the domestication of animals and demarcation of property, like I have said earlier, and the need for more labor to manage work. Animals' reproduction came to be thus controlled for production of meat and labor, and women became breeders for the workforce. In the United States, in fact, breeds of cats, dogs, and guinea pigs are customized and sold as consumables. They are sold as commodities as per their models, right? Animals, and we all know this, they are artificially inseminated, genitally masculinized, castrated, administered drugs, their fetuses monitored by inserting devices in their womb, in which many a times the animals and their young ones die under the guise of research and findings. These experiments are also reminiscent of the discipline of psychoanalysis, which relegates women to the realm of case studies, and accords them an inhuman status, as it claims to study repressed behavior and comes up with ailments and afflictions specific to the female body and biology. There are even accounts of Nazi experiments on women to see the effect certain drugs have on women. Treating a living being as a subject of experiment in itself implies according an inferior and an object status to that particular entity. And lastly, animals are sold as meat or as companions, and so are women. Women's bodies are sold and they are traded as wives. The hands that exchange the commodity are men's or driven by a patriarchal sensibility that operates on an economy of commodifying and a logic of otherizing. Especially harrowing is the number of human and non-human females who are subjected to contraceptive research. So there's a huge industry, the contraceptive and the reproduction industry, which carries out all its research on the bodies of female humans and female non-humans. And in this too, the most marginalized of the generally marginalized, the women of the third world, suffer the most since they are dispensable. Many contraceptives are marketed despite ambiguous results on animals because they are backed by a very strong and invincible pharmaceutical lobby. All this in the name of advancement, profit, and progress. Many third world countries are known to have separate wards in hospitals for men and women, and often women's wards are not stocked with antibiotics, anesthesia, and other necessary drugs. Women are in fact compelled to undergo dangerous and painful labor, which is a life and death, near death experience. A novel comes to my mind, Khalid Hosseini's Thousand Splendid Suns. You must read it. It gives an account of a cesarean delivery of a woman in a hospital in Afghanistan where there is no anesthesia because it's a woman's hospital. So they just cut her open without anesthetizing her, right? So the scientific discourse based on these and numerous such experiments to find out levels of competition, aggression, violence, strength, and dominance in male and females of the species set out to thus prove the lesser status of women, intending to essentialize these traits in women. So summarily stated, there are innumerable ways which have institutional authorization that are systematically, regularly, and unconsciously used to exploit both women and animals for scientific insight. Both women and animals are lesser mortals whose suffering and death can be justified in the name of scientific advancement. Whether it is animals who are, and they are linked in another way also. Now, see, whether it is animals who are tested for cosmetics and cleaners and their harmful effects to be used by women. So, who are the users of cosmetics and cleaners? They are women. Or whether it's animals who are killed and skinned for their furs to be worn by women, right? The real agency, the real power lies with the industry that considers both animals and women as manipulatable and usable and commodities to be enjoyed. So the industry is controlling the woman as the consumer and the animal as a consumable. So, and again, another parallel would be in the domestic space, women provide food, animals provide themselves for food. Women cook and prepare, animals are cooked and prepared, right? And here I'm quoting Carol Adams. She gives a very interesting, I'm quoting from an excerpt of her research paper. She says, people with power, this is again a discursive construct. People with power have always eaten meat. Dietary habits proclaim class distinctions, but they proclaim patriarchal distinctions as well. Women, second class citizens, are more likely to eat what is considered to be second class food in a patriarchal culture. And what is that? This is the Western world, of course. That is vegetables, fruits, grains, rather than meat. The sexism in meat eating recapitulates the class distinctions with an added twist, a mythology that meat is a masculine food and meat eating a male activity, unquote. Can we have the next slide, please? Now, here I'm sharing a very interesting poem with you, and it is amazing, the extent of semantic derogation where women are compared. The animal metaphors are used, but not in a positive sense, to talk about women. And you can read it for yourself. It says, from the start, the gods made women different. One type is from a pig, a hairy sow, whose house is like a rolling heap of filth, and she herself, unbathed in unwashed clothes, reposes on the shit pile, growing fat. So, this is one kind of a woman. Another type the gods made from a fox, pure evil and aware of everything. This woman misses nothing, good or bad. She notices, considers, and declares that good is bad and bad is good. Her mood changes from one moment to the next. So, this is the second type of woman who is like a fox. One type is from a dog, a no good bitch. A mother through and through. She wants to hear everything, know everything, go everywhere, and stick her nose in everything and bark whether she sees anyone or not. So that's the kind of misogynistic uh, creation which you can see, and the instance of the extent of semantic derogation. In fact, this makes us reflect that metaphors are instrumental in constructing social identities, right? So the dominant social group imposes the hegemonical ideology through its linguistic means. And here, then, we have a clear consciousness of the white, male, heterosexual self and its juxtaposition with the other, the woman. So, obviously, when a group is categorized as an animal or as having animal traits, it is intended at degrading the group. Obviously, it's not a eulogy, it's a degradation, right? Besides that, this otherizing is also engaged in assigning value to certain characteristics in animals. I mean, we have to realize that, right? That animals are being attributed human characteristics over here, like a fox is cunning and a pig is filthy and a bitch is whatever she is. So, in fact, that value assignment is degrading the animals also. So it's achieving both degradation of animals, degradation of women, and basically this is part of the otherizing project, right? Can we have the next slide, please? So now moving on, like I said, ecofeminism has not only needed theorists and writers, but it has also always required activists. And we have many instances of writer activists also, and some prominent names. In fact, these people, especially Vandana Shiva, Arundhati Roy, they are widely present on YouTube. They have a phenomenal digital footprint, and you can just go out there, listen to their lectures on YouTube, and they are doing remarkable work. So, what is Vandana Shiva's fight all about? Her fight is against Monsanto, which is looking at corporatizing agriculture, and it is all about owning the seeds of farmers. Not giving farmers the ownership of seeds, bringing seeds in the market that are terminator seeds. In fact, imagine seeds that give life. It's so paradoxical that seeds can be called terminator seeds, which means that the next year you have to buy a fresh lot of seeds. You cannot use the same seeds to sow your to kind of raise your crop. You have to buy the seed from the corporate entity. So Vandana Shiva is against the corporatization of farming, like I said, and monoculture, which promotes cultivation of only one variety of crop for farming. She looks at sustainable models of farming and agriculture, which can also be empowering for women because she promotes biodiversity. The sustenance of this new mode of survival based on development and progress, according to Shiva, is located and can be enabled only through the death of nature. So she says you are corporatizing farming under the pretext of development and progress and advancement and whatever discourse you want to float, but eventually it is going to come at the cost of the death of nature. And if you listen to Shiva's talks, you will find out how many indigenous varieties of crops are lost to us because our farmers resorted to one kind of crop. They focused on maybe the sole cultivation of only wheat or only say cotton, and that had a devastating impact on the whole rural economy. And in fact, she links it with the farmer suicides also, right? And she says this kind of a project is not inclusive, and because it is development and progress only for some, the rest are expendable. So that's Vandana Shiva. Then I have mentioned Sundarlal Bahuguna, who was at the forefront of the Chipko movement. Though the idea was his wife's, he has been fighting for the preservation of the Himalayan forest for years now. And he's, in fact, even spearheaded the anti-Tehri Dam movement starting in the 1980s, and it went on to early 2004. Then you have Arundhati Roy. In fact, I have mentioned in my slide that Arundhati Roy's stand is against nuclear armament, but in fact, she stands against mining. She's against damming. She's against indiscriminate industrialization. And I will recommend this collection of her political essays, which came out just last year, I think. It's called My Seditious Heart. You must read it. It's a fabulous compilation of all her political essays. Now, most of us, we think, oh, she wrote just one novel which got her a Booker, and then she went into hibernation, and she's often called urban Naxal and all of that, and then she comes up with a second novel which is The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. What was she doing in between? Oh, you must read her political essays. They are a phenomenal work. And though, yes, she gets very emotional and she gets carried away at times, but the essays are very carefully footnoted. It is not that she's, taking rabbits out of her hat and saying whatever she wants to say. The essays are with evidence. So you must read them if you want to hear the alternative narrative that is going on. Right. And then, of course, you have Medha Patkar and her crusade against the Sardar Sarovar project, which made her a canonical activist. But she's also part of various crucial political and economic issues raised by tribals, Dalits, farmers, laborers, and women facing injustice in India. She's also been against this project, which is happening at Lavasa for unjust water use, and especially in a state critical for farmer suicides. And in this protest, she is with P. Sainath. P. Sainath is the author journalist who I spoke about earlier, right? Then you have Mahashweta Devi. I'm sure as academicians, we are all familiar with her work. She was a socio-political writer activist, and her studies of Adivasi, Dalit, and marginalized citizens with a focus on their women was what constituted majority of her works. In fact, she lived in Adivasi villages in West Bengal, and that's how she came to know the plight of the people, the tribals, the marginalized in West Bengal, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, and Chhattisgarh. And she befriended them, she learned from them, she cohabited with them, right? So, in fact, her in her work, she has embodied their struggles and sacrifices, and her characters are also depictions of that. In fact, she even claims in one of her interviews that her stories aren't her creation, they are the stories of the people of her country. She led the movement against industrialization by the West Bengal government based on land grabbing from farmers. So that was the activist Mahashweta Devi. And I think you'll realize that most of the time, like Arundhati Roy says, that writing is activism on paper. So the two go hand in hand. If your writing cannot bring about a change in society, a change in mindsets, a change in the hegemonical discourse, then you're hardly doing anything, right? So writing has to lead to something. Writing has to lead to transformation. It will take time, but it's happening. It's happening on the ground. A very heartening change is that I think this Hindustan Lever, which has dropped fair from Fair and Lovely. It doesn't say fair and lovely anymore. So for that also, it took us so many years, to develop that kind of a consciousness that fair does not necessarily mean lovely, and lovely is not only fair. So now they have dropped the fair word. So that's a good example over here to cite, right? And especially it's so, it is absurd in a country like India, where we have people with such different, such rich complexions, right? Such varieties in complexion. Right. And then, of course, the latest rage is the Swedish activist. She's in her teens, right? Greta Thunberg. I mean, she's again very popular on YouTube, and she's very vocal about the whole global warming business and the need to, kind of do something with the climate issue. And she's of course doing she's becoming the voice of the young generation, and she's quite a powerful and emphatic voice, right? Can we have the next slide, please? Now, coming to the area which we love the most, I'm sure, as academicians, right? Let us look at ecofeminism as a critical tool. So, because as academicians, it's important that we explore it as a critical literary applicable tool, right, to analyze texts, and especially texts that are a part of our canonical literature. Now, if you look at these texts on your screen, I want you to ask a question to yourself: where are the women in these texts? And they are all part of canonical literature, right? None of these texts have any significant women characters. I think King Solomon's Mines just has a minor character and one major female character, but she's a vamp. She's a witch. So obviously we can't count her. And I'm sure you may have read some of these books growing up as children, or you might be teaching some of these books, because these are canonical texts. They are prescribed all the time as part of our college and university syllabi. And where are the women? That's my question. So they are nowhere. It is evident, therefore, that the urge to territorialize, conquer, and amass wealth is primarily a masculine urge. Men, please don't be angry. I'm not targeting you. I'm just targeting patriarchy. Okay. So I have nothing against men. Even men can be feminists. Feminist is anyone who believes in the equality of all genders, right? So there's nothing about men and women here. But if you look at this, this is a patriarchal project. So what I'm trying to say is the all of these texts, they have to do with territorializing, occupying, uh, capturing, or laying your claim to new land. So which is what leads us to think that the urge to territorialize, to conquer and amass wealth is primarily a masculine urge. The colonizing project and the imperialist enterprise is consequently a patriarchal enterprise. So, out of these books, I am going to be looking at The Lord of the Flies, which is a canonical work, and it's a canonical text in English literature. And our normative understanding of The Lord of the Flies is that I'm sure you're familiar with The Lord of the Flies, right? It's about these group of children who get their plane crashes and they get marooned on an island and they start living on pretty much all of these texts are about people who are trying to figure out and get their head around an island. At least four of these are. But this particular book is about a group of children and how then that group breaks into two factions where the head of one group, who is Jack, becomes a dictator like person because he says we are the hunters, so we'll give you food. And the other group has a very democratically elected leader called Ralph, right? And Ralph is a very accommodating, very democratic leader. He believes in equality of everyone. But eventually, Jack wants to become the leader, and then he's out for blood, and he kind of is out for Ralph's blood. And the whole book is, if when we teach it in class or when we try to understand its symbolic implications, we treat it like a political allegory, right? A political allegory where it basically depicts the warring nations, you know, the allies and the allies on the one side and the other countries on the other. And basically the allegory is about the Second World War and the warring nations and the rise of military dictatorship. Now this is the hegemonic reading of Lord of the Flies, right? I'm going to contest this, and I would like to expose the ecophobic gaze of the writer as a white man who otherizes nature and who invisibilizes women. So I'm not looking at the normative reading of The Lord of the Flies. I'm deconstructing the normative reading and I'm looking at an alternative eco-feminist reading. First of all, there are no women in the novel. So that's one very obvious thing. Can we have the next slide, please? And then the other things will become more obvious to you. Right. So a critical reading of The Lord of the Flies. So I am claiming that Golding's gaze is the white Western man's ecophobic gaze. He's afraid of nature, right? So throughout, if you see, Jack is the one, Jack, who is the villain, becomes one with nature. He goes back to, he's very happy on the island. He doesn't even bother to think about getting out of the island. His concern is survival, and Ralph's concern is escape. So these are two clashing ideologies. Ralph wants to go back to the civilized world, and by projecting Ralph as the hero and Jack as the villain, it's as plain as black and white. Ralph is white, Jack is black. Okay, now by projecting Ralph as the hero, as a very conscientious, democratic leader, and by empathizing or identifying with Ralph's desire to go back to the civilized world, what is Golding doing? He is demonizing Jack, who has adjusted with the natural world. He's not only demonizing Jack, he's also suggesting that this kind of a life is bad. The primitive way of life is bad. It is cruel. It is savage. It is just not acceptable. So if you look at the slide over here, I have written in the red box, by suggesting that the rituals are an external manifestation of Jack's inner mental and moral erosion, Golding berates the primitive way of life which gives away the enlightened white colonizer's fear of the other within and outside himself. So we have an other self in us, and we have the other self. So the internal other and the external other, both are reasons of anxiety for Golding, and he's in denial. So what he does is he demonizes, he otherizes, he primitivizes nature and characters that are close to nature, right? Then the third thing is that the construct of the savage, because in the course of the narrative, Jack emerges as the savage who is completely settled in the island, and he's out for Ralph's blood because he wants to be the king. And he has stopped wearing clothes. He has started painting his face. So, in fact, he is transferring all tribal qualities onto Jack, and in the process showing that implying his spiritual and moral degradation. Do you see where I'm getting at? That if you look at the tribal in the picture, face painting, this is a way of life. You know, it has got nothing to do with being good or being bad. It's just a way of life for the savages. I mean, for tribals who live in the forest. But when he shows Jack resorting to that, simultaneously he's also showing that Jack is distancing himself from civilization. He's becoming more and more bloodthirsty, and he's becoming more and more immoral. So the construct of the savage becomes a projection of white racist anxiety. So something similar to what Coates does in The Heart of Darkness, if you have read the novel by Joseph Conrad, where he villainizes Coates, who's a white man, but he's trying to say that this white man, because he's in the heart of darkness in the African continent, he is absorbing the dark, negative, elemental qualities from around him in Africa. I think someone has opened. Thank you. Then I told you, complete absence of women. So obviously this whole race for territorialization becomes a masculine preoccupation. And lastly, it's a very interesting thing that nature is used very conveniently as a setting in the novel. You will not find a single animal which the children befriend. Nature is always presented as threatening, menacing, unknown, alien, with dark secrets, and which can take your life. So there is nothing life-giving about nature. Can we have the next slide, please? It'll become clearer to you with the next slide. So how is the island treated? The island is treated as something which needs to be occupied and claimed to, right? And both Jack and Ralph's factions are fighting for it. And this again shows the colonizers, it's the colonizers' subconscious, right? Even Golding is part of the colonizer fraternity. So it's his subconscious also manifesting in the narrative, where through their projects, whether it's Ralph or whether it's Jack, both in their own way, they are trying to lay claim to the island. One is a civilizing project and one is a primitivizing project, but both are nonetheless treating the island as a passive entity which can be laid claim to. So it's a virgin land, right? And it's untrodden territory, which is the standard classic narrative, the standard classic imperialist enterprise. If you look at the Europeans taking over North America, taking over South America, taking over Africa, you will find the same narrative in The Lord of the Flies. Can we have the next slide, please? Yeah, and finally, like I was saying, nature is menacing. There is ever-present danger, and this projection of nature as something where there is ever-present danger is largely market-driven. Because as readers, we would like to see nature like that. We enjoy watching movies that have a forest setting, and then you have that suspenseful music in the background, and music is very manipulative, of course. And then you're like, oh my god, what will happen next, so there's always this man nature duality in the Western tradition. Man is never in harmony with nature. It's always man against nature, man versus nature. So nature becomes a symbol for the dark, the unknown, the menacing, and the dangerous, crystallizing into the central symbol of the beast. Now, this beast, the beast becomes a metaphor, and this beast keeps coming into the children's dreams, and the children get nightmares of the beast, because at night they sleep and they see shadows in the trees. The trees acquire a different kind of semblance once the sun goes down, and the children keep imagining that there's a beast out there. And there's a whole central symbolism of the beast which needs to be found out, which needs to be destroyed, which needs to be hunted out, right? So nature keeps coming back to haunt them, and this further alienates the children from nature. And this is a very deliberate project, a very deliberate progression of the narrative, right? Yeah, can we have the next slide, please? So this was an attempted eco-feminist reading of The Lord of the Flies. I would like to end with Stephanie Lahar's quote, where she says, "There is not a place in the world that does not reveal the touch and bear the consequences of human hands and mind." So I would just like to add to this and say, from the Antarctic to the deserts, to the tropical rainforests, to the grasslands, whatever we do has a direct impact on every corner, every inch of this planet. Therefore, we need to be careful what kind of fingerprint we'd like to leave behind. And like Greta Thunberg says, climate change in a dying world is not a phenomenon of the future. It is happening now, right now as we speak. Maybe it has slowed down a little because of the whole coronavirus pandemic. We were just going head on without bothering about the collision which we were headed for. So maybe it has slowed down, but nonetheless, it is happening right now. Ecofeminism is a way of conceiving and working towards a more inclusive world, which acknowledges women, animals, trees, rivers, mountains, forests as entities, as autonomous beings who have a right to exist. It is a way of saying no to military capitalism, neoliberalism, free market economy, weapon trade, industrialization, indiscriminate scientific pursuit, genetic engineering, all under the umbrella of capitalist patriarchy. And I'd just like to end with Mahatma Gandhi's quote. Like he said, there's enough in this world for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. So that is what ecofeminism is concerned about. So thank you so much for being with me in this. And I'm done with my presentation, but I would be very happy to take questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Ma'am, we have a few questions in the chat box.
Right.
May I?
Let me just. Yeah, you will have to. No, I can also open it. Yeah, let me see. Yeah. You can take. Okay.
Yes. Ma'am, shall I?
Yeah, please. Go ahead, ma'am.
Okay. Would you please highlight some eco-feministic elements in J.M. Singh's play?
I haven't read him. Who's that?
J.M. Singh.
No, I have not read the author. Okay, I could see one question. Could you please throw some light on the spiritual correlation between women and nature in any literary work? Spiritual correlation between women and nature. I would say a lot of Toni Morrison's works, they would have, this kind of I don't know if you have read this, though most of her works are very difficult actually to understand, because they are very complicated. They follow that stream of consciousness technique. But her women characters are very, she writes on the African American community, right? And they're very close to nature. And she is a writer who, at least through her writings, espouses and endorses the spirit world. So whether you read her Beloved, or you read her Paradise, or even if you read her Love, Paradise is the best actually if you want to find this kind of an interconnection where the women come up with an alternative lifestyle on the outskirts of a village, and they are completely in harmony with nature. And because they are so much in harmony with nature, and they follow an alternative kind of a spiritual existence, they are branded as witches by people in the village who cannot for the world imagine that there could be these group of women who are existing like this, who have a self-sustaining model, who are not dependent on the village economy, right? And that is why they are hounded, and in fact they are branded as witches. And there's an attempt to kill them and destroy them, and some of them escape, some of them meet in an afterlife. So there's a whole overlap of the material, the physical and the spiritual world, with nature playing a very active role in it. It's not like Golding's nature, which is just like the National Geographic forest, where we are just tracing the tiger's moves accompanied by suspenseful music. It's not like that. So nature is quite a living, breathing, harmonious entity in Toni Morrison's works. So, but let me think of some other works. I'm sure there would be. Okay, I'll come back to this. Let me see if there's. This question, by the way, was from Swati Reddy. So thank you, ma'am, for this question. Okay, there's another by Srinidhi Murlidharan. She says, are you trying to say that in ecofeminism, nature, trees, land, or animals need not every time be referred as woman, but the main point is equating them, nature and women, in terms of oppression and possession by the dominant? Yes, that's right. They needn't be equated every time, but more or less the nature of oppression. Like if you go back to the initial quote by Greta Gard, where she says that the same kind of institutional ratification which is required to oppress species, races, gender, classes, is the same kind of institutional ratification that is required to oppress nature. So the nature of oppression is the same. The systemic institutionalized violence is the same. It doesn't mean that every time a woman has to be naturalized or nature has to be feminized. These are also aspects. But it's the nature of oppression we are more worried about. It's the reductionist attitude which we are more worried about, where you treat nature, women, animals, trees only as entities that are meant to give you something, that are meant to produce, that are meant to be commodified and used for a particular purpose, right? So, yes. Do we have any more questions, ma'am?
Yes, ma'am, we have it from Shwanika Houghton. In Toni Morrison Beloved, suffering has been depicted in the form of a tree on the back of Seth. What is the symbolism of the tree?
Yeah. So, yeah, she has this thorn-like pattern, or where she was actually so I think an ecofeminist reading would suggest that see this, you look at the whole occupation business of the white race in America. They not only obliterated the indigenous communities wherever they went. Obviously, in India, they couldn't do that because we were already a thriving population and an ancient civilization. So they couldn't get around, toy around with us, though they tried their best. But in vast expanses where you had independent communities, A, they obliterated, they effaced the indigenous communities, and B, they took these people, they commodified the Africans who they brought along with them, and they reduced them to the status of animals, right? Where they use them literally as uh, mules and donkeys, the way domestic animals are used, denying them any agency, denying them a voice, denying them a subject status. The tree becomes the tree which is etched on her back because she's repeatedly beaten with a barbed wire, right, on her back, and that is how she gets that whole injury. And there's pus formation, and then it becomes septic, and somehow she survives it, right? So it could be looked upon as, if you see the picture which I showed you where man lays claim, the island, the palm, although it has its connections with Mao Zedong's philosophy also, but I am not using it in that sense. The way you lay claim to something, so if so that tree on her back, the injury on her back, on Seth's back, is a permanent imprint of the exploitation she has suffered. And in that sense, she is like like an extension of nature, you know, because her depiction is, she is identified, she is related to the tree graph, right? So just the as, and if we look at tree as standing for a synecdochical, a metonymical representation of whole of nature, and that nature imprinting itself on the woman's back through an act of violence, what does it mean? That nature is being violated, the woman is being violated. It's very clear.
There is a question from Geeta Krishnan. Could you please suggest some of the contemporary works with elements of ecofeminism?
Yes, actually, I would suggest that you read the works of non-fiction by Vandana Shiva and Arundhati Roy, and you can also have ecofeminist strains in Mahashweta Devi's works. You will definitely find it because nature and women both overlap in her works. Then Toni Morrison, like I said. Yes, and definitely Arundhati Roy's political essays and Vandana Shiva's works are a must read, even P. Sainath for that matter. Like I said, it's not only women who are eco-feminists, you have a lot of men also who are eco-feminists and who are doing very good work.
There is a question from Bindu Shekhar. Could you suggest works on neo-feminism?
No, I am not. I wouldn't be able to. I could get back to you. Yes, Farhad Peer, I agree with you. It's actually political instability and rapid foreign invasions that has snatched the basic necessities like medical facility, education, etc. You are referring to Khalid Hosseini's Thousand Splendid Suns. I do agree with you, sir, but it's also true that within the narrative space, if the writer is giving us a picture where there are certain facilities, there are certain medicines that are available in the men's hospital and they are not available in the women's hospital. So clearly there is a sense of discrimination over there. And this does not happen only, this is a very common phenomenon in all third world countries. I mean, I'm sure even if you go to the villages of India, you will find the same kind of discriminatory treatment. You know, where if something goes wrong with a girl child, or if a girl child is suffering or a woman is suffering, normally she's not even vocal about it because women are tutored, they are conditioned to bear pain from very early on. You know, pain is part of a woman's life. That is what that is the discourse she's brought up in, unlike in a man's case, right? So it's nothing unusual. I'm sure it's not just about Afghanistan. I'm sure even in India, this could be a situation where if there is such a thing as entitlement, where if there's medicine and there's only so much of it, who gets it? It will be the men who will get it and not the women, at least in some sections of the society. Like food, you know, who gets it? I mean, you have this happening even in middle class families. I could tell you, I had a friend and we both went to the same school, and I would see that the day the milkman didn't come and there was a little milk left in the house, her mother would give the milk to her brother and not to the, to the son and not to the daughter. This is a question of entitlement. And the first part is obviously correct. Yes, the first word has milked Afghanistan dry. That also goes unsaid. You must read Noam Chomsky and his works to understand how America's war against terrorism is actually America's war for terrorism. You know, the countries it offers the most aids to, those are the countries where it sells most of its, a majority of its weapons to. So that's how it works. The most terrorized countries are the ones to receive American aids, because both go hand in hand. So that's first world politics. So I agree with you over there. Yes. Do we have any more? I'm just reading the chat box.
Participants, do you have any questions? If you have any questions, kindly unmute yourself and you can directly ask questions to the key speaker. If you have any.
Yeah, I would like a face-to-face question also, if there's one.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello.
Is this Antara Saha?
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Will you please highlight on capitalist patriarchy?
That's what I did all throughout. My session was nothing but a take on capitalist patriarchy. Like I said earlier, it was colonialism and imperialism, which has been replaced by corporate capitalism now. So what is capitalist patriarchy? Basically, patriarchy is something which privileges men. It's an ideology which privileges men. We cannot blame all men for it. First of all, we have to understand that part very clearly. That there are even women who are loyalists of patriarchy. Okay, they would not like the system to change. They endorse patriarchy. Capitalist patriarchy comes with the new project of modernization, urbanization, industrialization, and also, let me tell you, people like you and me who are part of this so-called middle class, which is the consumer class. So we are all supporters of capitalism. It's because of neoliberalism and modernization that this class emerged, you know. So we reaped the benefits, but then that was at the expense of people who were lesser, who were less privileged. So, I mean, in a country like India, it's very difficult. Like, for example, people like us, we form around, say, 15 to 30% of the population. So, how much does that amount to if we are a country of 1.3 billion people? The rest of Indians are largely rural India, the marginalized in the cities, tribal India, and the sections that are invisibilized. So they are the ones to bear the brunt of capitalist patriarchy. Capitalist patriarchy is something that believes in assimilating, amassing, accumulating wealth, and that functions with a profit-making initiative, and that believes in entitlement in the hands of very few people. Entitlement, funds, and power in the hands of very few people. It doesn't believe in a communal existence. Again, communal in the sense of a commune, not in the sense of the religious context in which the word communal is used in India. So, and I think if you go back to my presentation, you will find instances where capitalist patriarchy has faces like military capitalism, like Islamophobia, like market economy, like neoliberalism, like industrialization. So all of this is part of capitalist patriarchy, like imperialism, colonialism. What we saw even in those novels, the absence of women. So that was patriarchy, and the idea that, okay, let us take over this land, and whatever grows on this land, whatever we find from this land is ours. In that sense, even Indra's killing of Puloman is an instance of capitalist patriarchy, right? Because it's a battle between two men. And then the woman is territorialized, along with what she represents, right? Or Veena's exploitation of Earth Mother, Prithvi, is also capitalist patriarchy.
And one question more, ma'am. Usually here we see the domination of women and domination of nature, mainly domination over women, and in all cases it is not. But when a woman is dominated by another woman, then how you can explain it?
Yeah, it happens all the time. Like I said, that patriarchy is an ideology. And you can have, like feminism is an ideology, patriarchy is an ideology, and you can have both women and men subscribing to patriarchy. Right? So you have women burning their daughters-in-law for dowry, which is a very patriarchal kind of enterprise, right? Because it's so it is not at all, the gender is not at all determined. It's not a defining factor at times. If the woman is in a powerful position, and you can't say that if it's a woman, she will empathize with another woman. No, if she's an endorser of patriarchy, if you read Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, this is what she says, that women are more resistant to change as compared to men, because they are not able to live in transcendence. They are wallowing in immanence.
Good morning, madam.
I also have one question.
Good morning, madam. Good morning, madam.
Sorry, too many people speaking at once. I can't hear anybody. Yeah,
Veena Singh. I'm Veena Singh. I want to ask a question. How can we define Panchatantra on the perspective of ecofeminism, since there are less women characters defined in Panchatantra? Vishnu Sharma.
Yeah, I think that will be a very interesting project to take up. Why don't you take it up? Because you can actually, it's again canonical literature, right? It's a canonical Indian classical literature, and you must actually trace, if there are no women, why are there no women? Because possibly they didn't want women to have visibility, they didn't want women to have agency, they didn't want women to articulate certain things, certain dictums, certain messages for life, morals for life, which had to come from a masculine authority perhaps, and that is why there are no women. So yes, that can be a very interesting project.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
This is Dr. Mehta.
Yes,
let me at the outset congratulate the organizing committee for holding such a nice, well-structured and highly successful FDP. I have been attending this program for last 5 days, and daily they are, having come up with very insightful, thought-provoking lectures. And you are also one of them, undoubtedly. It's a very, treat to listen to you. My question is that there are poets, and poetesses also. They have portrayed women at the backdrop of, glorifying their beauty and all those things, which I should not, speak openly. So don't you think it is also a kind of ecofeminism or something? What type of, literature is this? When they glorify beauty of a woman at the backdrop of nature, will you call it a part of ecofeminism or something else? What type of literature is this? I'm in doldrum, I'm in doldrum.
I will have to look at the context, but if you are talking about women writers, naturalizing women, I guess that's what you mean, where they are equating women with nature. I will say because women never had role models. They belong to a tradition of literary paternity. They can't borrow from women writers before them, right? So obviously the first stage of women's writing, you will find the works resonating what the male writers have been saying. Right?
No, I'm talking about the beautifying, glorifying their beauty at the backdrop of nature.
That's what I'm saying. That's exactly what men did initially.
There are poetess also.
That's what I'm saying. So the poetesses took after the poets because they didn't have other poetesses to fall back on. So if you look at feminist linguistics, or if you look at the history of, you look at feminist linguistics bring this up, and they say that women have to keep falling back on a tradition of literary paternity. They have literary fathers. They don't have literary mothers. So obviously, you will have the first generation of women poets doing exactly what their male predecessors did before them, the male poets did before them. It's only by the third or the fourth generation that you have this consciousness that we have to write something different. What did Charlotte Bronte do? She depicted Jane Eyre exactly as a man would depict, right? As a complying governess. And that's how you get the mad woman in the attic, right? Where this Gilbert and Gobar, what they say is that it's actually Bertha Mason who is the heroine of Jane Eyre, but Charlotte Bronte is very scared. She can't project her as the heroine. So she has to conform to a masculine representation of a female stereotype, and her psychological anxiety that manifests as an external projection through Bertha Mason. So it's only the second or the third generation of women poets who will stop doing this. It's exactly like Miss Saha's question, where she says that how do you justify women exploiting other women? Of course they do. Of course they do. Like women emulate. So in their exploitation, they are emulating, they are conforming to patriarchy. Similarly, in depicting women as beautiful in nature's backdrop, they are just conforming to patriarchal traditions of literature.
Thank you very much for your very nice answer.
Thank you, sir.
Ma'am, can I ask?
Yes, yes, sir. Who is that? I can't see you on my screen.
I'll just unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Shankar Padmanabhan, sir. Is that right?
Yeah, I question in the chat box.
Right, sir.
Regarding matriarchal societies which still exist, in some places, are they just a formality or they have managed to escape the system?
I think they're a formality in today's times, because I don't know what we mean by matriarchal. See, Kerala used to have a matrilineal society, right? But and then there are some few tribal communities where maybe if the modernization project has not touched them yet, you could call them matriarchal. But I don't believe matriarchal societies exist today. In fact, I don't believe they existed ever. Because if you look at the works of anthropologists and comparative symbologists and mythologists, especially works of Marija Gambutas, then you have David Kinsley, you have Joseph Campbell, and if you look at the works of these people, they definitely say that in the Stone Age and the Copper Age, you have evidence of an egalitarian society where women, it is very evident from the cave paintings, from the tablets, the inscriptions on the tablets, that women played a very active public role.
Yeah, they were
but
equal
at the most, we can say that it was an egalitarian society. We can't say that it was a matriarchal society where men were under women. But there is enough proof that women were engaged in business, trade, administrative responsibilities, and they were priestesses in temples. With the advent of the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, what happened was the invaders, the northern invaders, they are called the northern invaders, who came and started invading the Near East, Anatolia, Sumeria, and that is how they desiccated the goddess cultures. Right. So where and these societies, they revered the goddess, they revered the divine feminine. But the northern invasions replaced this with a patriarchal ideology, the father god. So if you see, the father god is the god who wields the thunderbolt. So you have Zeus, you have Indra, who have and the father god erupts from a mountain. So erupts from the lava in a mountain. So that's the father god replacing the mother god. So I don't really believe that. I mean, it's not a question of I believing. I think there is no sufficient anthropological evidence that we ever had matriarchal societies across the world. At the most, we had egalitarian societies where women played a very prominent role. And they were also politically very active.
Okay, thank you.
Right, sir.
Ma'am, good morning, ma'am.
Yes, sir.
Ma'am, I am Dr. Y. Venkateswarlu from Andhra Pradesh, madam.
Yes, sir. Good morning.
Yeah, I felt very, very happy the way you explained ecofeminism and all the things.
Right, sir.
And recently I submitted, my students who have been submitted my under my guidance regarding the novels of Amitav Ghosh, ma'am. Amitav Ghosh, in which I emphasized the significance of the women who showed as a meta. I mean, only toys of the toys in the hands of the men.
Okay.
Who dishonored women as a toy for their selfish motto, whether it is getting pleasure and happiness and all. So they, Amitav Ghosh also showed women sometimes as an earth. So in this point of view, how can we similarize similar women as the days nowadays are concerned, ma'am?
Could you come up again? What is your question? I understood the context, Amitav Ghosh's novels, and
Yes.
yeah. So, what is your question?
Take for example, ma'am. Actually, his
give me a
recent novel, Sea of Poppies.
Sea of Poppies, okay.
In which he explained the significance of the women who underwent so many trials and troubles due to, due to man's selfish motto. So she was, there is a woman called Draupadi. Actually, her name is Diti. She who abused by the, the central character of that Sea of Poppies book. She was actually abused a lot, ma'am, because of lack of, certain significance in the society. So in that novel, Amitav Ghosh showed that there is no significance for the women, women in the society.
So that's exactly my point throughout, right?
That
women are the worst hit under the assault of capitalist patriarchy. And what is happening is, though communities are being marginalized on from an economic point of view, but at the same time, there's this whole project of ideological mainstreaming, because you have to understand that when a tribal community gets displaced and when they migrate to the cities, they have to adopt the ways of the city, right? So obviously, when they are adopting the ways of the city, it's not only the lifestyle and it's also the ideology, the worldview of the city. So from the point of view of ideology, they are being mainstreamed, but economically and socially, they are marginalized. That's the paradox of these indigenous communities. So displacing them from their natural habitat is leading to their assimilation in the hegemonic patriarchal worldview, where women are so these same men who maybe in a community or when they are in the hills or in the forest, they believe in an egalitarian setup. But when these same families migrate to the cities, the men will follow the exploitative patterns which they see around them, right?
Thank you so much, ma'am.
You're welcome, ma'am.
Yeah, and I'm sorry for that because we have taken much of your time, I think.
No, not at all. Technical glitches happen all the time. Thank you so much for being so participative. And in fact, I can see a few of my course-mates over here, and it's so exciting. So thank you so much for being with me today. And thank you so much for your observations and your insightful comments. And hope you had some takeaway from this session, but do read the books, which I strongly endorsed, because they are lovely reads. Whether or not ecofeminism is your area of academic pursuit, I will suggest very strongly that you do read these works. They're fabulous works.
Thank you, ma'am. So, participants, we are at the close of the session and we are at the end of the program. So we wish to end it with a formal vote of thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Department of English, Saurashtra College, I take this an opportunity to propose vote of thanks to those who have directly and indirectly supported me to conduct this faculty development program. At the outset, I thank our resource person, Dr. Shayanti Talwar, Assistant Professor of English, for setting aside her quality time to engage us with her sheer resourcefulness. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for enlightening us.